Good day all. This talk will examine the tradition of feminism. Like the other theories we've examined, feminism has its roots in 18th and 19th century European philosophy and social theory. The difference is that while the other three developed into full-blown schools of thought in the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, feminism took until the latter half of the 20th century to do so. The reason for this is very simple. It's only when Western higher education systems were greatly expanded after World War II that significant numbers of women were able to gain a higher education for the first time ever. Before that, only the occasional rich woman was able to do so. This meant that for a long time, feminist theory consisted of lone voices crying in the wilderness. Only after the creation of an educated women's intelligentsia after World War II could a lot of women start writing feminist theory, allowing it to become a true school of thought. Feminism was perhaps more similar to Marxism than to the other two theories, in that it is not just an academic theory, it is also the voice of a social movement, the women's movement. For feminists, as for Marx, the point of theory is not just to understand the world, but to change it, to bring women equality with men. The women's movement and feminist theory are generally considered to have progressed historically in three waves. The first wave lasted from the 1830s to the 1920s. The second wave lasted from the 1960s to the 1980s. And the third wave has lasted from the 1990s to the present. However, before any of these waves, the late 18th century saw the first stirrings of feminist writing. It is widely held that the first major feminist author was Englishwoman Mary Wollstonecraft, who was known particularly for writing A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792. This book was explicitly a reply to a book published the previous year, Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. Paine, together with other theorists of the time like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, created the theory of liberalism, which challenged the doctrine of aristocratic privilege and instead said that all men are created equal and therefore have certain inalienable rights. These ideas in part inspired both the French and American revolutions, and the US Constitution still says that every American has the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Wollstonecraft totally agreed with this, except that she said that women should have all the same rights as men. In particular, she said women were being denied their rights in the fields of politics, economics, and education, and that needed to change. Her position, which built on liberalism, formed the basis for what is now called liberal feminism. This position was actually supported by most male academics at the time, but not so much by businessmen and politicians. For example, British Prime Minister Horace Walpole called her, and I quote, a hyena in petticoats, unquote. Despite this vehement opposition from the male establishment, women began to organize in the early 19th century. In the US, the first wave of the women's movement got organized in the 1830s and gained international attention in 1848, when the first Women's Rights Convention was held at Seneca Falls, New York. In Canada, Confederation in 1867 gave the women's movement the impetus to pressure the new federal government into giving women economic and property rights in the 1870s. In addition to economic rights, the first wave fought steadily for political rights, meaning the right to vote and to stand for political office. those who publicly fought for those rights were termed suffragettes. It took close to a century of struggle, but women gained those rights in the US federally in 1920 and in Canada province by province in the course of the 1920s. In Canada, this struggle was particularly difficult because, in the eyes of the law, women were not persons. They were the private property of their fathers while young and of their husbands once they married. In other words, women had the legal status of slaves. Women had to get the law changed to recognize that women are actually human beings or persons before they could gain any political rights. After this victory, the women's movement went into a lull during the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II. The struggle for women's rights took a temporary backseat to the struggles against mass unemployment and then fascism. But after World War II, as I said, more women gained a higher education, and by the early 1960s, a whole generation of women was ready to make their voices heard. The trigger for the second wave, which at the time was called the Women's Liberation Movement, or Women's Lib, is widely held to be the publication of American Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. This book caused such a stir that in 1966, Friedan was elected the first president of the National Organization for Women, NOW, which is still the main organization fighting for women's rights in the US. Friedan's work largely followed in the footsteps of Wollstonecraft and established the school of liberal feminism. This is the oldest and most widely held school of feminism, so these days it's sometimes referred to as mainstream feminism. However, the 60s and 70s saw an explosion of feminist writing, and it was not long before other schools of feminism began to appear. Since Marxism also claims to fight for the rights of the oppressed, inevitably some women adapted Marx's ideas to women's struggle and established the school of Marxist feminism, also sometimes called socialist feminism. Like Marxism, this is a political economy approach which focuses on fighting for women's political and economic rights. Equal pay for equal work was one of their best-known slogans. The late 60s saw the rise of radical feminism, which defined society as a patriarchy, meaning that it was male-dominated in all of its institutions. Radical feminists called for radical changes in society and drew particular attention to the social problems of male violence towards women, especially domestic violence or wife battering, and the sexual objectification of women in our culture, which promotes rape and sexual harassment, which is of course still being fought, for example, by the #MeToo movement. Apart from liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, and radical feminism, other schools of feminism did emerge in the second wave, but they have only been adopted by small groups of academics. I would argue that only those three main schools of feminism have gained a widespread following. The 1990s saw the emergence of the third wave of feminism. In organizational terms, the third wave is largely a continuation of the second wave. However, the third wave has taken the women's movement and feminist theory in a new direction. The main criticism that women had of the second wave was that it was dominated by middle-class white women and so largely ignored the problems of poor and minority women. By the 90s, middle-class professional women, meaning doctors, lawyers, professors, and so on, had essentially gained equal pay with their male counterparts. But working class women's pay, which means most working women's pay, has continued to lag behind working class men's pay. I would argue that it was inevitable that when the women's movement first got going, it would be led by women's leading sector, educated, affluent women who had some leverage in man's world. But, to women's credit, within a generation they realized that they had left some of their sisters behind, and they decided to redress that. So third wave feminism focuses on what's been termed the double burden faced by minority women. They are oppressed once as women and again as members of a minority. Now, the term minority most commonly refers to an ethnic minority, and indeed, some of these women are women of color. However, there are other minorities, such as handicapped women, single mothers, and lesbians. Each of these groups of women faces their own set of social problems and social discriminations. As each of them began to present their viewpoints, we saw, for example, the emergence of queer theory, presenting the gay viewpoint. In the late 90s, these differing views were brought together by Dorothy Smith's standpoint theory, which argued that we have to see society from different social groups' standpoints in order to gain a balanced understanding of it. It also argued that men have ignored women's standpoint for far too long, especially that of minority women. Standpoint theory emphasizes inclusivity. It is not about choosing the right standpoint and then rejecting all the others. No, it's about recognizing that each group has the right to its own standpoint, and that each standpoint needs to be respected by society as a whole. This is the attitude that I would take towards all of the schools of feminism that we've looked at. I would argue that each of them focuses on a particular aspect of gender relations and gender inequality. Liberal feminism focuses on culture and politics. Marxist feminism focuses on the economy. Radical feminism focuses on biological issues ranging from male violence to reproductive rights, and standpoint theory focuses on minority rights. Like sociology's main theoretical traditions, each of them asks different questions and so gets different answers. For a full understanding of gender in our society, we don't need to choose between them, we need to combine all of them. In particular, feminism needs all of these theories because for the women's movement to attain its goal of gender equality, women need to fight for equal rights in all of these areas of society. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day, all.